Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So, has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
When we think about the 18th century church, we think of famous preachers like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. Few people know that there were also Black pastors preaching the gospel. One of these men was Lemuel Haynes, who was probably the first African American ordained by mainstream Protestant churches in the United States. Stay with us as we learn more about his life, his ministry, and the struggles he had to face here at Kids Talk Church History. I'm Sophia, I'm 16, and I live in Orlando, Florida.
I'm Linus, I'm 15, and I live in San Diego, California.
I'm Sean, I am 14, and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
So I've heard about a few Black pastors in America, but they were preaching to Black congregations. I think Lemuel Haynes was unique because he preached in a church where most people were white.
That was definitely quite unusual at that specific time.
Yeah, if you think about how difficult it was for Phyllis Wheatley to convince people that she was able to write good poetry, and she lived around the same time, and some famous people like Thomas Jefferson were saying things like Black people were inferior to white people and could never excel in the arts or sciences.
Yeah, we just had an episode about her.
Quick question, was Haynes enslaved like Phyllis Wheatley?
So I read that he was abandoned by his parents and rescued by a family who raised him until he was 21. But he was with them as their servant, and he had to attend a church for Black people while his family went to a church for white people. With this family, he learned to read, and he read as many books as he could. He loved the Bible, and he even tried to write some sermons. He became a soldier for a while in the War of Independence, and then finally a pastor. So I'm not sure how all of this happened, but that's why we have an expert to ask questions later.
How did a white congregation accept a Black pastor?
So the first one did not do that so well because it was an all-white congregation, and some of his members didn't like the idea of having a Black pastor, so he left after 2 years. And his second call to the pulpit in Vermont lasted for 30 years, so that one went much better. And that's when he became famous for his sound preaching. And in 1804, he received an honorary master's degree from Middlebury College, the first master's degree given to an African American.
I read a story about a time when he was a pastor and he had to counsel these two men who were going to be hung for murder. But they kept saying they were innocent, but no one believed them. Then shortly before the day of their execution, the victim showed up. He wasn't dead at all. He had just left town for a while. Haynes wrote it down, and this story became a bestseller.
Someone could definitely make that into some kind of movie.
I don't know much more about Haynes, but I read that he was a very well respected as a pastor and writer. He wrote about slavery, and he died in New York when he was 80. So we'll let our expert speak more to his life and works and tell us the rest of the story. Our expert today is Dr. John Saillant, professor of English at Western Michigan University and author of the book Black Puritan, Black Republican, The Life and Thought of Lemuel Haynes. Dr. Saillant, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you heard us say a little bit about Haynes, and we only scratched the surface of the information we could find on him. Did we get anything wrong, or is there anything you would like to add that is obvious or much needed for our discussion?
I think you got one little fact wrong, which is that as a child, he attended a Black-only church. There were none in that area in Connecticut or Massachusetts. The church that he attended was divided between old Calvinists who had some notion of the freedom of the will, often called Arminians, and a very strict Calvinistic church, which saw God as totally sovereign. And he went to the latter. And that's the church in which he became a minister. But it was not all Black.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. That's important. Thank you. So to ask our first question, we know that some Africans joined the war for independence on the side of the English because the English promised them freedom. But Haynes fought on the side of the colonists. How did he make that decision?
Well, this is a very deep question, and I think the major question for Black people in the Revolution. Slavery was a very old institution dating back to the ancient world, mentioned in the classics, mentioned in the Old Testament, the New Testament, many later works. And so slavery itself was known to virtually everybody who was familiar with the Bible or the classics. Within the 18th century, there came to be a critique of slavery that we call abolitionism. One of the critiques, in fact, was that slaves could never be truly virtuous and religious because they were always under the thumb of their master. Abolitionism was much more advanced in the northern states than in the southern states. So the northern states, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, soon to be Vermont, New Hampshire, later Maine. These were the relatively newly abolitionist states. The southern states, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, these are the old slave colonies from the past, were not at all abolitionist. So I think that in the North, people like Haynes believed that if the Americans were victorious, they would move to end slavery. Black people in the South did not believe that in the least. And in fact, they fled to the English thinking that the English would free them. The English freed some, enslaved others, betrayed others. But I think most fundamentally it was where this hostility to slavery as an institution had most developed. And that was the North rather than the South.
So considering like the social political climate at this time, how was Haynes able to go to college? Were Black people accepted at universities? And if so, what was his experience like?
Well, this is also a very deep question because college was nothing like what we think of it as today. College was only for boys and only for relatively elite boys and a very young from our perspective. So college age could be maybe 12 to 16, which of course for us is more like middle school and high school. So in the sense of going to a college that existed at the time, like Yale or Harvard, he did not go. His degree was honorary. However, what kind of study many people, and once again, more typically boys, though some girls, did was with a learned person. And the term we use for future preachers who had this kind of education is the school of the prophets. So they would live with a minister's family. They would often do farm work or something to support their room and board, but they would study the scriptures, theology, exegesis, preaching techniques with the minister. And then they could go on to apply for ordination. And that usually required an examination. It could be a temporary pulpit, which we call historically a supply pulpit, and then hopefully your permanent pulpit at the end. So he didn't go to college in the sense of Yale or Harvard. He did study with a very, very learned minister in Connecticut. In fact, a couple of them. One named Farrand, one named Bradford. He did receive, as an adult, an honorary degree from Middlebury, a master's. Maybe I think today we'd call this a master's of divinity, but in his time it was simply a master's, and that was his college experience. I would also say it was very effective. He was a very a sensitive reader of the Bible. He wrote very wonderful sermons. In fact, he ghost wrote sermons for white men too, by the way. Okay, so other people recognized his talent, and this this question has a lot to do with prior discussion about missions and how do we do outreach in the church and whatnot. And the prior generation or two of Calvinistic or Puritan ministers were what we call evangelical Calvinists, as opposed to high Calvinists. So high Calvinists essentially believed that the church membership was created by God sometime in the past, and only family members of those original people would ever be in the church. There was no reason to bring other people in. Evangelical Calvinists, like George Whitefield and also Methodists, actively went out seeking people. And so this is their version of missionizing. And so I would say they actively sought out Haynes as being a young mixed race man who should, learn about the faith, showed talent, could be a minister, and the rest is history.
Did he ever get married? And if so, do we know anything about his wife and children?
Yes, this is also fascinating. He married a white woman. It was stated at the time that she proposed marriage to him. Now, this seems unlikely given gender expectations at the time, but they might have had to say that because for a black man or a mixed race man to be seen as too aggressive wouldn't be good. So we have the idea that her name was Elizabeth Babbitt, that she proposed marriage to him, and they had happy marriage, a long marriage. I can't remember the number of children, but a lot, maybe 8 or so. And she was his helpmate for life.
I know he had some problems in the first church he pastored because some people didn't like to have a black pastor. But in the second church, he was appreciated. Was it unusual for black preachers at that time to be well accepted as pastors in almost all white churches? And did whites and blacks worship together in that church?
Well, this is also a very deep question. He did have a practice ministry in Torrington, Connecticut, which I think now is incorporated into the town of Bloomfield. And apparently his preaching was theologically successful. Remember, these are also extremely well-educated Christians who know a lot about the Bible, a lot about historical theology, but nobody ever said they didn't want a black pastor, but he was not voted in. And then he went on a missionary tour of northern New England, and he found a pulpit in West Rutland, Vermont. And I think here we have to go back to the comments made by the previous speaker that many missions or many missionaries, mission activity were to places where there were already Christians. So it wasn't an idea that nobody knows anything. We just have to go and teach them about the Bible, but rather places where, in effect, there weren't ministers. So I don't know if everybody had a chance to look at the little folder of images I sent, but I included a map that showed where he moved. So as you left the coastal regions in the late 18th century, which would be for us maybe like New Haven, New York, Providence, Boston, and went into the country, there were very, very few ministers. So those were places where people were hungry for preaching. And, I hate to put it this way, but maybe somebody's race wasn't such a high barrier because they desperately needed a minister. And actually, he was extremely talented as a writer and as a preacher. And my guess is that had he been white, he would have gotten a really sort of desirable church in southern New England. But he wasn't. And so he ended up out in the country. And this is a place where, like I said, there was a shortage of ministers. Your last speaker talked about, once again, missionaries going off, preaching places where there were already Christians. There's a great story, and this is in Wales, about a preacher under the sponsorship of the Countess of Huntingdon, who was also Phyllis Wheatley's sponsor, who preached among the coal miners in Wales. And they were crying because they had never heard a sermon in their lives. Right? So these are people who, culturally know something about Christianity, but because of geography and what's perceived as, undesirable place where they live or whatever, they have no ministers. So when a good person comes around, they're very, very welcoming. So I think that was the logic behind all this.
The title of your book is Black Puritan, Black Republican. We learned about the Puritans, but they were in the 17th century. Why did you call Haynes a Puritan?
Well, that's a very controversial point, and some people have said I was wrong to do that. But many people see a line from Puritanism through the 18th century, including Jonathan Edwards, Samuel Hopkins, Lemuel Haynes, a lot of other names, maybe you've never heard of, Joseph Bellamy, Amos Pettingill, all sorts of characters. And I think that is true, that the Puritan spirit stayed alive, even though it became much more evangelical and much more missionizing. And part of that is something I think is going to come up in questions, but it's a dedication to the absolute sovereignty of God. And so the Puritan or the Reformed understanding was that God controls all events, and humans are essentially just working out something that God has already planned for them. And even, for instance, the crucifixion, many people believed was actually planned by God from the beginning of time. Right? That's one understanding of the Bible, of Christianity. It's not the only one, but this was the Puritan idea, and this survived. In our own time, I think relatively few people would say that God planned the crucifixion at the moment of creation. But that's something that Haynes believed, for instance. So we do have this idea God is totally in control of everything. And there is material in the Bible that suggests that. Also material that suggests that people have free will. But anyway, that's the Puritan spirit, and that's what Haynes believed. And actually, as your prior speaker, I forget his name, sadly enough, but there were Calvinistic Baptists at this time too, who were totally dedicated to this idea that God controls everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it goes a little deep, but just a few more questions about your title. You call him a Republican. Could you explain what you mean by that? And then also, you say that he's a Black Republican. What would he? Did people back then just say black, or was there a different word for African Americans?
Well, let's take the first question first. Republican at this time didn't mean anything having to do with today's Republican Party. So the meaning of Republican in politics has changed over time. So, for instance, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but then Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump have been Republicans too. So that definition has changed a lot over time, but Republicanism in the 18th century meant no king. So, no monarch in control of everything, and people voting for legislative bodies. And actually, Black people could vote. Black men could vote in some of the northern states. Now, for the word Black, that was used. The slur word that we have all heard, but we don't use normally if we have good manners, was also known. French versions like noir and negra were known. Spanish and Portuguese words like negro were known. Occasionally, you may see African, very often colored. Also, at this time, people were really sensitive to exactly what was the shade of your skin. So we had a lot of words like mulatto, quadroon, all sorts of words that indicated what people thought about you racially. So there was a big variety. I think in our own time, we are sort of fallen into black and white. But historically, people have been very sensitive to what they think your heritage was.
And what were some of the ideas and doctrines that Haynes wrote about?
Let's go back to your prior speaker. Haynes was opposed to infant baptism, for instance, right? Because in this understanding of Calvinism, you had to have had a conversion experience or become a Christian or experience saving grace to be baptized. Today we call that believer's baptism. And so he was an adherent of that. That's something a little back and forth in American history. And there still are believer baptism groups, of course. I think the fundamental thing is to go back to Calvin and Edwards and the Reformed tradition is an understanding of the absolute sovereignty of God such that people don't have free will. And this is something that distinguished Protestants from Catholics during the Reformation. And even Catholics, struggled with exactly how powerful God was. And so, of course, in theory, God is all powerful. The official Catholic dogma is God leaves people free to choose good or bad, heaven or hell. But Ignatius Loyola, who was a great Catholic theologian and sort of author of a handbook on Catholic life, said that we know God determines everything, but we must never speak of it. So Christians in my view, Christians have always tended to this idea that God is so powerful that he doesn't allow people to be free. And it's hard to get away from that idea. But most fundamentally, I think that was Haynes's idea. And then it goes to the level of God even predetermined slavery, but for his own purposes. Okay?
Yeah, so now we're going to move on to some more lighthearted questions. So first, how did you get the idea of writing about Haynes?
I did not initially start writing about Haynes. I wanted to write about white men of his generation, such as Thomas Jefferson, Timothy Dwight. You might have heard of him. He was president of Yale College. But Dwight knew Haynes, and he invited him to come to Yale to give a sermon. And I saw this and I thought, oh, this is weird. Who is this guy? And then I started studying about him, and then just one thing led to another. And I kind of took the ball and ran with it.
Do you have a favorite church history character besides Haynes?
I like the leader of his school at the time, who was Samuel Hopkins. He lived in Newport, Rhode Island, where, in fact, my family is from. I grew up in Rhode Island. I never lived in Newport, but my family is from there. And he wrote many great sermons, but he has a whole series of sermons which forms a really thick book on Christian friendship. And I actually thought it was the best book I ever read. And I usually take notes on books. But when I started reading this, I thought this is so great, I can't even take notes because I could never do it justice.
And finally, do you have a favorite hobby apart from writing?
I have two hobbies. One is that I'm a runner, biker, so I'm a little bit of a fitness fan. And I know you all know about that. But I also do something that maybe you would associate with your grandparents. I buy, sell, collect, and restore vintage audio gear. And so if you've ever seen old silver face receivers or, turntables with wooden bases or giant speakers, I'm your guy. I buy that stuff. I restore it cosmetically, electronically. I collect some. I sell some, and And people ask me why. I do listen to it, by the way, but I just tell them it's like stamps, but just really, really big stamps.
Dr. Saillant, we're so thankful that you agreed to spend this time with us. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And listeners, be sure to check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, and let us know what you think of these episodes, and please keep asking questions. And we'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Linus and Sean, I'm Sophia. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.